So this is the door of the church, and in the end, if you keep going through this historical story, Nietzsche observes in the end that the church wins, Jesus wins. He asks the question in the genealogy of morals, well, who is in Rome now? And of course it wasn't the Roman Empire. If you're talking about the 19th century, we're talking about the Vatican and the church and church power. So what's at work, says Nietzsche, in the genealogy of morals, under this surface of virtue and under this surface of submission and vulnerability and giving, he says basically there's a power game going on. And Nietzsche's philosophy in some ways could be summarized as a philosophy of power. He's like a doctor, or he's diagnosing power games which go on underneath the surface of social, cultural norms. Now, let's see if we can take this idea of power and being suspicious about power, especially when it expresses itself as something good and giving and nice and so on. Let's see if we can take his suspicion about power and apply it to the climate crisis to see if there are power games going on underneath the surface of green virtues. And I think it's possible to do it. If you look at, as we've already seen in terms of the individual carbon footprint, well, the fossil fuel industry has put a lot of money into making that story the major dominant narrative story of the climate crisis. So what we experience as a virtue in the individual carbon footprint turns out to be a kind of subversive trick by those in power to distract us from the big questions of power about energy infrastructure. Likewise, let's take another concept. Let's take the green transition, or the notion of transition. So people use the word transition a lot, and a transition to green renewable energy is exactly what we need to do. This is the way indeed that we get out of the crisis. But we should not be using the word transition now, because it's not happening yet. The green transition is not happening. What is happening now is an energy addition. It's not a transition, it's an addition. Look at the numbers. So I'll put here the numbers for the last years since the first COP 1 to COP 30. Look at these numbers. These numbers are going in one direction. They're going up. We are adding energy. We are adding an energy demand all the time. And yes, there are solar panels. Yes, there are renewable energies. Yes, in some vectors, in some ways of looking at it, there is more green renewable energy happening. But this green renewable energy has only ever taken the edge off the increase in the overall increase in fossil fuels. So we have not yet managed to push down the increase in fossil fuel energy. All we've done is manage to diminish the increase, but it's still increasing. We are still in an energy addition phase. And yet people talk about the green transition. How can we help the transition? How can we accelerate the transition? The transition hasn't started yet. So this nebulous idea, because we see lots of solar panels and we see lots of green initiatives, the idea that the transition is underway, I would argue it isn't. And it's one of those sort of virtues which is presented, and we kind of live under this kind of virtuous feeling that there's an energy transition when it's not happening. Now, that, let's say, vandalistic view, or this iconoclastic way to dismantle the big narratives about climate change, is something which I think Nietzsche would be in favor of. course, things would be a lot worse if we didn't have those green technologies now. But that's missing the point. We are still increasing fossil fuels. We are still burning more and more fossil fuels every year. We up to 42 gigatons per year. We're not going in the right direction. We're still pushing the accelerator and we're not pushing the brake. So having clarity about that would transform the way in which the media reports, it would transform the way in which politicians would be able to talk about things. So it's important to be clear-minded and not have these like foggy, kind of warm green ideas. It's important to look at the truth. So Nietzsche's deconstruction of Christianity, you know, he grew up as a kid growing up here, his dad being the pastor of this church. It wasn't comfortable for Nietzsche to pull into question these things which were, you know, socially comfortable, but he was a brave thinker, and that bravery led him to say things which are like culturally extremely significant and extremely important. Another example, so we've got the individual carbon footprint, we've got the green transition. Also, I noticed that whenever there's a bit of pressure put on climate change, and people start talking about it, or let's say the fossil fuel industry during the Paris Agreement, for example, came under a little bit of pressure there to change and so on, then you often get a resurgence of what's called the circular economy. Now, the circular economy, again, is a good thing. Like the individual carbon footprint, we need a more circular economy. Our linear economy at the moment, an extractive economy, is not sustainable. So we need to curve the economy to make it a loop, to make it more circular. This is undeniably a good thing. But the circular economy essentially is like recycling plus plus plus. It's not something which deals with the fundamentals. It's not a concept, it's not a response to the crisis which is ever going to get us out of the crisis on its own. Now, I know that people who are into the circular economy don't make that claim that, well, this is the only thing which is going to work. But the thing is that because we don't have clarity about the fundamentals, because we don't have clarity on the fact that we are accelerating in emissions, on clarity on the fact that we are still 82% dependent on fossil fuel for our energy infrastructure, when you don't have clarity about those big systems truths, then these smaller details, like the circular economy, like the individual carbon footprint, they can take on this, let's say, spiritual dimension, or this like, this is the way forward. And when you don't have clarity about the boundaries, then these things in a way just become almost like a distraction. So they're valuable, they're important. The circular economy, individual carbon footprint, it's all valuable, but it's only valuable once you have the big picture in place.